Welcome to Nightingale. We're so glad you're here and hope you'll subscribe to catch all our captivating stories and unravel the mysteries with us. Your feedback is important, so please let us know your thoughts and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We truly appreciate your support. Miss Marple in a Quiet Compartment. Chapter 1. The Silent Passenger. The afternoon was still, with just a touch of a breeze. A slow train was patiently waiting at Paddington Station, ready to start its journey through the countryside. Inside one of the older, wood-paneled compartments, Miss Jane Marple had settled into her seat. She'd been in the city for a few days, visiting old friends, and was now heading back to her peaceful village of Westbury-on-Thames. The train wasn't modern by any stretch of the imagination. The walls were polished wood, the seats were covered in dark green leather, and the windows needed a good shove open even partway. Brass racks held a few bags, and the air had a faint scent of coal and soap. Miss Marple quite liked this type of train. It reminded her of slower, older days when people had the time to pay attention to things. She sat comfortably, with her small black handbag resting on her lap. A ball of red wool and 2 knitting needles moved gently in her hands as she worked on baby booties for her neighbor's granddaughter. Miss Marple wasn't one to sleep on journeys. She preferred to observe. It was her quiet habit to watch, listen, and notice the little details that others often overlooked. There were 4 other passengers in her compartment. To her left, by the window, sat a young woman in a maid's uniform. Her dress was simple, and a small cap perched at a slight angle on her head. She clutched a worn handbag and looked exhausted. She offered Miss Marple a polite smile, but didn't say anything. Miss Marple noticed her rough hands, neatly trimmed nails, and the way she kept her eyes down. These were the signs of someone used to being in service. Across from them sat a serious-looking man with neatly trimmed gray mustache. He held a folded newspaper under his arm and wore a dark suit. He had the stiff posture and keen eyes of someone accustomed to giving orders. His polished shoes and military-style watch led Miss Marple to believe he was a retired colonel. She'd seen plenty of his type at village gatherings. Next to him was a pale woman in her 30s with a book titled Modern Child Psychology in her lap. She hadn't turned a single page in at least 10 minutes. Instead, her eyes kept drifting toward the glass window, where she could see faint reflections of movement in the corridor. She seemed lost in thought, but her fingers were gripping the book a little too tightly. Miss Marple guessed she might be a schoolteacher. There was a nervous energy about her. Finally, just as the train was about to leave, a young man with a green tie hurried into the compartment. He seemed rushed, slightly out of breath, and took the last empty seat. His brown leather satchel rested on his knees. He kept adjusting his watch strap and shifting in his seat. Miss Marple had seen many clerks and office workers act the same way, nervous, polite, and always checking the time. The train gave a gentle jolt and started to move. A loud whistle echoed across the station. Buildings flashed past the windows and slowly gave way to green fields, tall hedges, and narrow village roads. The leaves on the trees were just starting to turn. It was the beginning of autumn. Inside the compartment, the passengers settled into a quiet stillness. Miss Marple continued knitting. The maid leaned her head against the wall and closed her eyes. The man with the green tie gazed out the window, lost in his own thoughts. The woman with the book still hadn't turned a page. The colonel was reading his newspaper, occasionally frowning at the headlines. Miss Marple observed them all. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. People revealed themselves in the way they sat, moved, or didn't speak at all. Her years in the village had taught her that. She believed that even the smallest gesture could tell you something important. About 10 minutes into the journey, the compartment door opened a crack. A young woman appeared in the doorway. She looked well-dressed, put together, and self-assured. Her coat was stylish, but not showy. She carried a small handbag and wore a delicate perfume, light and floral, but definitely expensive. Her voice was soft as she spoke. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I think this one's full." She glanced quickly at the passengers, gave a small nod, and moved on to the next compartment. A charming young lady. The colonel muttered without lowering his paper. Miss Marple didn't say anything, but she had noticed a few details. First, the perfume. It was far too expensive for the plain handbag the girl was carrying. Second, her train ticket had a small tear at one corner. That was unusual. People with class, or who were careful, usually folded their tickets neatly. A torn ticket often meant someone was in a hurry or was careless. She quietly filed these observations away in her mind. The train reached its first stop, a small station called Little Whittingham. A few passengers got on and off. Nothing out of the ordinary occurred. Then, a few minutes later, something strange caught Miss Marple's attention. It was a sound, not loud but definitely odd. A faint scraping sound, like cloth against metal, then silence, and then a soft thud, like something falling. It didn't sound like a suitcase or a heavy step. Just wrong. Miss Marple peered through the glass window in the door, trying to see into the next compartment. But she could only see reflections and shadows. She leaned back in her seat, her hands paused over her knitting. Something was definitely off. Then it happened. A scream, high-pitched, sharp, and sudden. Everyone in the compartment jumped. The maid woke with a start. The colonel lowered his newspaper. The man in the green tie froze. Miss Marple didn't move, but her eyes became intensely focused. The compartment door flew open. A conductor rushed past. "Please stay seated, ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly. "There's been an incident. Everything is under control." The train began to slow down, not at a station, but near a signal post. Miss Marple looked out the window. The fields were passing by more slowly now. The train's movement was gentle, but there was a palpable tension in the air. 5 minutes later, 2 men in uniforms passed their compartment. One was carrying a black leather case. Clearly a doctor. A few minutes after that, the conductor returned. He looked pale. "If I may," he began, "we request your cooperation. A young woman has been found in the next compartment. She appears to have been attacked, possibly murdered." A quiet gasp came from the woman with the book. The maid clutched her bag tighter. The man in the green tie looked down at his shoes. "Murdered?" the colonel asked simply. The conductor nodded. Miss Marple said nothing. She only whispered to herself, "A murder on a moving train. That means careful planning." The train rolled slowly to a stop at a small countryside halt called Fernley Crossing. A local constable was waiting with a bicycle. The body was removed. A few quiet words were exchanged. Then an announcement was made. No one was to leave the train until they reached Westbury. Miss Marple turned to the woman with the book and spoke gently. "You're a teacher, I believe." The woman blinked. "Yes, nursery level." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "You've had the same page open since London." The woman looked down, embarrassed. "I couldn't focus. I was distracted." Miss Marple said no more. She went back to her knitting, but in her mind, she was thinking about the perfume, the torn ticket, the scraping sound, the thud, the scream, and how none of the 5 passengers claimed to have seen anything. Miss Marple knew something. She didn't know who the killer was yet, but she would soon. Chapter 2. A Compartment of Secrets. The train had started moving again, slowly and cautiously. The countryside drifted by like a quiet painting, but inside the carriage, everything had changed. Miss Marple continued knitting, but her mind was racing ahead. She was thinking, watching, and remembering every little thing she had seen and heard since the train left Paddington. She knew something others didn't. People lie. People hide things. But people also forget they're being watched. The compartment door opened again. This time, a tall man entered. He wore a plain brown coat, and his badge identified him as a railway inspector. Behind him was a younger man in uniform, holding a small notebook and pencil. "Ladies and gentlemen," the inspector said, "I understand you may be frightened, but I must ask you a few simple questions. Please remain calm." No one replied. Miss Marple gave a small nod. The inspector pointed to the younger man. "He'll take down your names and where you boarded the train. Then I'll speak with you individually. It won't take long." The notebook came out. The man began to write. "Your name, please?" he asked the colonel. "Everett. Colonel Thomas Everett, retired. I boarded at Paddington." He moved to the woman with the book. She looked nervous. "Catherine Weldon," she said quietly. "I'm a nursery teacher. Also from Paddington. The man in the green tie gave a sharp nod. Edward Price, clerk at a shipping company, Paddington. The maid hesitated, then said, Marianne Walters, housemaid, Paddington, 2. When he reached Miss Marple, she smiled gently. Jane Marple, she said, Westbury-on-Thames. I was returning home from a short visit to the city. The younger man noted it all down and stepped outside to report. The inspector stayed behind. He looked around the compartment. You were seated here the whole time? Everyone nodded. No one left during the journey? Again, head shook. Miss Marple looked up. Inspector, may I ask, how was the woman killed? The man paused, surprised by her calm tone. She was stabbed, he said quietly. No one saw anything. The compartment door was locked. No sign of a struggle. One clean wound. A very sharp object. Possibly a hatpin. A hatpin, the colonel repeated. Rather unusual for murder, isn't it? Yes, the inspector agreed. And no hatpin has been found. The man in the green tie spoke for the first time. Wasn't anyone sitting with her? She was alone, said the inspector, and her name was Clara Barnes. Miss Marple looked down at her knitting. That name, Clara Barnes, didn't mean anything to her, but something else did. She remembered the woman clearly. Polite voice, neat coat, expensive perfume, a torn train ticket. Inspector, Miss Marple said gently. Did the woman have any luggage? The inspector shook his head. Just a handbag, small. Was it searched? Yes. Nothing inside but a comb, a mirror, a small purse, and one lipstick. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Gardenia scent. The inspector looked surprised. Yes. How did you know? I noticed it, said Miss Marple simply, when she opened the compartment door, and I found it odd. That perfume is rather expensive. Her handbag was not. The inspector narrowed his eyes. You're very observant. I live in a village, she said, and I knit. It gives one plenty of time to notice things. The inspector gave a short smile, then left the compartment. As the door closed behind him, everyone seemed to relax a little. The colonel folded his arms. The teacher closed her book. The man in the green tie exhaled slowly. The maid looked down at her lap. Miss Marple watched them all. She noticed the teacher's fingers were trembling slightly. She noticed the man in the green tie had a faint ink stain on his sleeve. She noticed the maid's gloves, still perfectly clean, and something else. She remembered that small ripping sound she had heard before the scream. It had been too quick for a struggle, too soft for something heavy. She thought about how the woman had spoken so calmly at the door before choosing another compartment. She thought about the torn ticket. Why would a ticket be torn? Then a strange thought entered her mind. What if Clara Barnes wasn't supposed to be in that seat at all? What if someone had lured her there? She didn't speak her thoughts yet. She was still watching. The maid, Marianne, leaned her head back and sighed. You all right, dear? Miss Marple asked kindly. The girl looked startled. Yes, ma'am. Just shaken. That poor lady. You didn't know her? No, ma'am. Miss Marple nodded. I didn't either. But she seemed like someone who had a secret. The maid looked down quickly. Miss Marple looked out the window. Her reflection stared back. Her thoughts were moving faster now. The train stopped again, this time at a small signal, for 5 minutes. No one boarded. Outside, the trees stood tall. Inside, the air felt heavier than before. The conductor returned with tea. He offered it to each passenger. Miss Marple accepted hers and took a small sip. The maid refused. I'm all right, she said. The colonel accepted his with thanks. The teacher shook her head. The man in the green tie took it, but didn't drink. Miss Marple noticed that, too. She turned to the teacher. You said you teach nursery children? The woman nodded. But your book is more advanced than nursery level. The woman blushed. I want to do further studies. I'm just beginning. Miss Marple smiled kindly. That's very good. Education is never wasted. But in her mind, she noted the contradiction. The colonel spoke next. Do you think this was robbery, Miss Marple? No, she said. The handbag was untouched. It felt personal. Someone she knew then, possibly, or someone who wanted her to think she was safe. There was silence again. Outside, the field stretched far. Miss Marple looked at the maid's shoes. Spotless. She remembered something else. Something very small. When Clara Barnes had opened the door, she had looked at Miss Marple directly, but she had also glanced quickly at the maid, almost as if she recognized her or feared her. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. She thought of something very old, an old case from her village, a girl who changed her name and returned as someone else, quiet, unnoticed until it was too late. Could it be the same here? Could someone be pretending? Suddenly, she felt a deep certainty. Someone in this compartment knew Clara Barnes, and someone didn't want her alive. Miss Marple kept her face calm. She picked up her knitting again. Outside, the sun began to sink lower in the sky. Inside, Miss Marple was stitching together something far more important than wool. The pattern of a murder. Chapter 3. Everyone has something to hide. The train continued its slow journey through the countryside. The sky outside had darkened, with gray clouds drifting gently above the open fields. Inside the compartment, everything was still and silent. No one spoke. Miss Marple sat with her knitting in her lap, her fingers moving steadily, but her mind was sharp and fully awake. She wasn't ready to declare who the killer was just yet. That would be foolish. But she had already seen enough to understand one thing clearly. Someone among them was hiding something. It might be small. It might be serious. But something was definitely wrong. She glanced up quietly, without drawing attention to herself. The colonel sat with his arms folded, eyes half shut, pretending to rest. The young man in the green tie looked out the window, tapping his foot every few moments. The maid had her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes fixed on the floor. The woman with the book kept turning it in her hands, but hadn't read a single page. Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag to adjust her yarn. As she leaned forward, she spotted something small on the floor, a red thread. She picked it up silently. It looked exactly like her wool, yet she hadn't dropped anything. She folded the thread into her handkerchief. Quietly, no comment. Maybe it meant nothing. Or maybe it meant everything. Miss Marple had learned never to rush to judgment. She turned slightly to face the maid. "My dear," she said softly, "you seem very calm. That's a strength in times like this." The maid looked up, startled. "I don't feel calm, ma'am. I'm just trying not to cry." "Understandable," Miss Marple said kindly. "It's a dreadful business. A young woman murdered on a train." "Yes," the maid whispered, "and I didn't even know her." Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. She believed her. The girl was scared, clearly shaken, but not giving off the impression of guilt. Yet something didn't quite fit. The maid had been rubbing her hands nervously for quite some time, but her white gloves were still spotless. Still, Miss Marple asked no further questions. She turned to the woman with the book. "You said you teach nursery children, didn't you?" The woman looked up quickly, then gave a nervous smile. "Yes, I work with small children. That must take a lot of patience." "It does," the woman said softly. Miss Marple gave a warm smile. "The book in your hands, Modern Child Psychology, seems quite technical for a nursery teacher." The woman hesitated. "Well, I suppose it is. I just borrowed it recently." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "A good mind always keeps learning." The woman smiled in return, but there was discomfort in her eyes. Miss Marple noticed the way she clutched the book. Her knuckles had gone pale. What was she afraid of? Miss Marple turned to the young man in the green tie. She had seen him check his watch 5 times in the last 30 minutes. "You seem quite punctual," she said pleasantly. He gave a small chuckle. "Force of habit, ma'am. I work in an office. Timing is everything. You got on at Paddington, didn't you?" "Yes." Miss Marple nodded, then glanced at his shoes. They had a thin line of dried mud near the soles. That was odd. Paddington Station had clean, tile platforms. No dirt, no mud. So where had he really been? Miss Marple stored the detail carefully in her mind. She didn't accuse anyone. She didn't judge. She simply observed. The maid hiding something. Not murder, perhaps, but a secret. The supposed teacher, nervous, not quite comfortable with the book she claimed to be reading. The young man, polite, but maybe not honest about his whereabouts. And the colonel, silent, perfectly at ease, perhaps too at ease. At last, the colonel stirred and opened his eyes. "I can't make sense of it," he muttered. The door was locked. There was no noise. How can someone be killed in a sealed train compartment without anyone noticing? Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It's quite a mystery." She paused, then added quietly, "But sometimes the person doesn't vanish because they were never outside to begin with." The whole compartment turned their eyes toward her. Miss Marple simply smiled and returned to her knitting. A few minutes later, a porter came by offering tea. Miss Marple accepted a cup. So did the colonel. The teacher refused. The young man took one, but didn't drink it. The maid drank hers quietly, with both hands wrapped around the cup. The compartment felt heavier now. Tension hung in the air like a fog. Miss Marple sipped her tea, but her thoughts were racing. She thought again about Clara Barnes, beautifully dressed, that light but expensive perfume, the way she had glanced into this compartment for only a moment before moving on. She hadn't chosen a seat randomly. She had been looking for someone. Had she found them? Was that why she had been killed? Miss Marple didn't know yet, but she felt the answer was very near, right here in this compartment. She glanced again at the red thread she had picked up. Then she held it next to her yarn. A perfect match. Too perfect. Had she dropped it, or had someone else used the same yarn? Someone who wanted to make it look like she had? She folded the thread neatly back into her handkerchief. There was no need to rush. Miss Marple knew from experience that when people are nervous, they talk, and when they talk too much, they often say the one thing they shouldn't. And when that moment came, she would be ready. Chapter 4. Whispers and Watchful Eyes. The train moved slowly around a bend, its wheels clanking rhythmically on the old iron tracks. Outside, the landscape had grown darker, with clouds covering the sky and the trees along the fields looking like shadows. But inside the compartment, the air remained tense. Miss Marple hadn't stopped knitting, but her fingers moved more slowly now. Her eyes, however, were sharper than ever. She had been thinking carefully about each passenger. Something was hidden. That much she knew. And now it was time to observe not just what people said, but also what they didn't. The train was scheduled to reach Westbury on Temp Ames in under an hour, but with a murder investigation underway, that might change. A conductor passed by the door again. This time he paused and looked inside. "Everyone all right in here?" he asked politely. Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you, young man, though I imagine things are far from all right." The conductor gave a tired smile. "Indeed, ma'am. We've called ahead. A detective will board at the next main stop. Until then, we've been told to make a note of anything suspicious." He looked at the group as a whole. No one said a word. After a moment, he moved on. The compartment was quiet once again. Miss Marple set her knitting down in her lap. "I do hope," she said gently, "that none of us are too afraid to speak if we saw something." The colonel gave a low hum. "If someone saw something, Miss Marple, they'd be wise to say it now before things get worse." The woman with the book finally spoke. Her voice was soft. "You think the killer is still on the train?" The colonel answered before Miss Marple could. "Of course. Where would they go? They couldn't have jumped off, not at full speed, and the compartments were locked from the inside." Miss Marple added, "It's quite likely they never left this carriage." A silence fell again, heavy and uncomfortable. Then Miss Marple gently leaned forward. "Shall we speak a little more openly now? We're all strangers, yes, but we've all seen the same things, heard the same sounds. Perhaps between us, we know more than we think." The young man in the green tie shifted in his seat. "Well," he said hesitantly, I didn't really see anything. But when that girl passed our compartment before, the one who was killed—" "Clara Barnes," Miss Marple supplied gently. "Yes, her. When she looked in, I thought she was searching for someone." "She was," said Miss Marple softly. "It wasn't chance that she looked in here." The young man cleared his throat. "I thought she looked straight at the maid. I mean, no offense, but she seemed to pause for a moment. All eyes turned toward the maid. She looked up, her face pale. I don't know her," she said quickly. I swear it. I've never met her before in my life. No one said you had. My dear, said Miss Marple kindly, but it's possible she knew you or thought she did. I've worked for the Wilsons in Beaksley for the past 5 years. I hardly ever come into London. The maid said, her voice trembling. Marple didn't push. Instead, she turned her gaze to the teacher. Perhaps you noticed something out of the ordinary, she inquired gently. The woman's grip on her book tightened noticeably. I caught a reflection in the window just before she turned and walked away. She looked genuinely frightened. Frightened, or perhaps just surprised. Miss Marple mused aloud. The woman paused, considering. Frightened, I think, she replied. The colonel tapped his fingers impatiently on his knee. None of this explains how she was murdered, he pointed out. Surely someone must have heard more than just a thump. That's what the conductor reported, isn't it? A thud followed by a scream. Miss Marple nodded in agreement. Indeed, and the scream didn't originate from Clara herself. That's what's so very peculiar about this whole situation. Everyone in the compartment looked at her in surprise. The scream came from another woman, Miss Marple explained, possibly the one who discovered the body. She paused for effect. But that implies that Clara didn't have time to cry out. She was struck swiftly, suddenly, and silently. The colonel frowned, clearly puzzled. That would require either someone with considerable strength or someone who caught her completely off guard. Miss Marple then redirected her attention back to the young man. If I may ask, she said, did you board the train earlier, just before it was scheduled to depart? Just before, he replied. I was running a bit behind schedule. And you arrived from Paddington, I believe? She inquired. Yes. Miss Marple gave a thoughtful hum, almost to herself. I only ask because your shoes appear to have mud on them, which isn't something one typically picks up at Paddington Station. The young man flushed, looking uncomfortable. I took a shortcut through a side alley. It had rained earlier. Of course, Miss Marple said gently, though the expression on her face suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. She then turned her attention to the colonel. And you, sir? I assume you were already seated when Clara passed by? The colonel straightened up in his seat. Yes. I didn't really pay her much attention. Just assumed she was another passenger looking for a seat. Yet you commented that she was charming, Miss Marple pointed out. He gave a stiff nod. Well-dressed, poised. It's easy to form an impression. Miss Marple said nothing more, but she watched his hands closely. They remained very still, the hands of a man accustomed to maintaining control. She wondered what secrets he might be concealing, if any. The maid suddenly spoke up again, her voice quiet. She had a mark, she said. Everyone turned to look at her. When she walked past our compartment, I noticed something on her wrist, a tattoo or scar. It was just a glimpse, but I remember thinking it looked like a number, maybe from a hospital. Miss Marple's eyes brightened with interest. That's very observant of you. Thank you. It was a seemingly insignificant detail, she thought, but sometimes small details are the key to unlocking even the biggest mysteries. The teacher now looked visibly uncomfortable. She fidgeted with the strap of her handbag. I'd like to use the washroom, she said quietly. Of course, said Miss Marple, her tone perfectly polite. You'll find it just down the corridor. As the teacher left the compartment, Miss Marple watched her go. There was something peculiar about the way she walked, not outright fear, but a nervous guilt. She glanced at the colonel. Would you mind checking if she returns within the next few minutes? She asked in a low voice. He raised an eyebrow, surprised. You think she might be planning to run off? No, said Miss Marple. I'm simply being cautious. A few minutes passed, stretching into an uncomfortable silence. The train rocked gently on the tracks. The young man looked even more ill at ease than before. Finally, the teacher returned, her face pale, her hands shaking slightly. She sat down without uttering a word. Miss Marple spoke gently, her voice cutting through the tension. We're all feeling tense, but I believe that someone among us knows more than they're willing to admit. She glanced at the small red thread she had carefully concealed in her handkerchief. Someone had tried to implicate her in some way. Or perhaps they had simply used her wool for their own purposes. She still didn't know who or why, but she was getting closer now. She could feel it. And if the killer believed that Miss Marple was just a harmless old woman with her knitting needles, they were in for a very unpleasant surprise. The train was now moving steadily through the dark countryside. Outside the window, the trees appeared as mere shadows, slipping by in the night. Inside the compartment, the atmosphere remained thick with tension. No one was speaking, but their silence wasn't peaceful or comforting. It was charged with pressure and unspoken fears. Miss Marple held her knitting in her lap, but her needles remained still. Her keen eyes darted from one face to another, taking in every subtle nuance. The silence in the compartment had grown heavy, like the steam building up in a kettle just before it whistles. She leaned forward slightly, breaking the silence with a soft question. Isn't it strange how silence can often reveal more than words ever could? The colonel responded with a quiet grunt, clearly skeptical. We've already talked quite a bit, Miss Marple. I don't believe that more talking is going to magically reveal the killer. Oh, I agree, said Miss Marple, her tone polite but firm. But it's not just about what people say. It's about what they do when they're not speaking that truly tells you the most about them. The young man in the green tie shifted uncomfortably in his seat once more. Since his earlier, somewhat forced confession, he had avoided making eye contact with anyone. Miss Marple had noticed that he kept one hand tightly concealed inside his coat pocket. She looked at him with a kind expression. Forgive me for asking, but is your hand injured in some way? He looked up, startled by the question. No, ma'am. Why do you ask? Because you're keeping it hidden, she explained. People usually do that when something is bruised or bleeding, or when they're trying to conceal something. His face flushed a deep red. Slowly, he pulled his hand out of his pocket. Around his wrist was a faint red mark. Miss Marple said nothing, but the colonel narrowed his eyes, clearly intrigued. It's just my watch strap, said the young man quickly, his voice slightly strained. Tight leather, that's all. Of course, said Miss Marple, smiling gently. Those leather straps can be terribly uncomfortable. They can pinch something awful. Then, she turned her attention towards the teacher. The woman had returned from the washroom earlier, but she hadn't been able to sit still since. Her foot tapped nervously against the floor, and her eyes kept darting anxiously towards the compartment door. You seem very tired, dear, Miss Marple said kindly. The woman let out a weak laugh, attempting to appear nonchalant. Yes, it's been a long day. Or perhaps a long memory, Miss Marple added in a low voice, almost to herself. You see, Clara didn't just walk past this compartment. She paused, and I believe that within that pause lies the answer to our puzzle. The maid looked up, her face pale and drawn. You still think she knew someone in here? I think Clara paused for a reason, Miss Marple reiterated. She recognized something, a face, a voice, or perhaps even a scent. The maid hesitated for a moment, then said slowly, she was wearing perfume, an expensive kind. It smelled exactly like the perfume of a lady I used to work for a long time ago. Clara had the same scent. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. And who was that lady? Mrs. Denham. The maid replied, she passed away about 3 years ago. After that, her family kind of fell apart. At that moment, the teacher suddenly stood up from her seat. I need some air, she said abruptly, and quickly left the compartment. Miss Marple watched her go, then turned to the colonel. She's afraid, she observed, not of what she's done, but of what might come to light. The colonel folded his arms across his chest. You think she knew Clara? I don't think she is who she claims to be, Miss Marple replied calmly. She's been clutching that psychology book like a shield, but she hasn't actually read a single word of it. Miss Marple stood up and quietly opened the compartment door. The hallway outside was empty and silent. She returned to her seat and sat back down. Clara Barnes had a past, she mused. A number tattooed on her wrist, perfume from a forgotten world, and a frightened glance into this very compartment. Every detail is a thread, and slowly, those threads are coming together to create a clear picture. The young man leaned forward in his seat, his curiosity piqued. Why do you think she came here? What was she hoping to accomplish? I believe, said Miss Marple, folding her hands in her lap, that she came to confront someone. Maybe not seek revenge, the colonel ventured. Maybe just to find some closure. And that got her killed, the young man added grimly. I don't think it was premeditated, Miss Marple said. I think someone panicked. It was a reaction, not a planned action. Again, the compartment fell silent, the unspoken accusations hanging heavy in the air. Then, the teacher returned, breathing heavily, her composure visibly shaken. Her eyes were restless, darting across the room until they finally landed on Miss Marple. I didn't kill her, she blurted out suddenly. Miss Marple gave her a calm nod, her expression unchanging. I never said that you did. But you knew her, didn't you? The woman trembled, her carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. She was my sister, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. My half-sister. We hadn't spoken in 10 years. A collective gasp rippled through the compartment. Miss Marple said softly, So that explains the perfume, the look she gave you, and your obvious nervousness. But why did you lie about your identity? I changed my name, the woman said, sinking back into her seat, defeated. I wanted to start a new life. Clara knew who I was. She recognized you instantly when she walked past, said Miss Marple. I didn't expect her to come looking for me, but she did, and now she's dead. I didn't kill her, the woman whispered again, her voice filled with despair. I swear I didn't. Miss Marple nodded again, acknowledging her denial. Maybe you didn't, but your revelation has opened a door, and that may cause someone else to feel the need to close it quickly and permanently. She looked slowly around the compartment, her gaze lingering on each of the occupants in turn. We're very close now. The person who killed Clara may still believe they're safe, but guilt is like smoke. It always finds a crack, no matter how small. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, drumming against the windows of the train. Miss Marple knew that the train was nearing the end of its journey, and so was the killer. The storm outside had subsided, but inside the train compartment, the atmosphere was far from calm. Rain still tapped lightly against the windows, tracing glistening silver lines down the glass. The compartment felt heavier now, not peaceful, but tense, like a tightly sealed room with secrets pressing against its walls, threatening to burst forth. Miss Marple sat still, her knitting resting untouched in her lap, a silent observer. Her face was composed, betraying nothing, but her mind was as sharp as ever, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. Clara Barnes was no longer just a name on a boarding pass. She was someone's sister, someone's regret, and perhaps, most dangerously, someone's threat. The revelation of the teacher's true identity as Clara's half-sister had cracked open the mystery, but Miss Marple knew that the truth ran deeper than that, much deeper, twisting and turning through layers of deceit and hidden motives. The colonel broke the silence, his voice gruff. So now we simply wait for the police to arrive, I presume? His words were clipped, but they couldn't entirely mask the discomfort that laced his tone. Miss Marple didn't respond directly. Instead, her gaze had drifted to his coat collar, where the wool had a faint twist, a subtle distortion, as if something had once pulled or tugged there. You've had that coat for quite a while, haven't you? She asked softly, her tone conversational. The colonel looked surprised, his eyebrows arching slightly. Since my days in Beaksley. Why do you ask? Oh, nothing, she said with gentle smile, her eyes still fixed on his coat. I was just admiring the quality of the stitching. But her mind wasn't focused on wool or stitches. It was focused on the evidence, the almost imperceptible clues that others might easily overlook. Clara had walked through the train with a clear sense of purpose. She had looked into specific compartments, and she had paused deliberately in front of theirs. That much had now been confirmed. But what had made her stop? Who, or what, had caused her to hesitate? Miss Marple stood up gently, her movements fluid and graceful. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I simply need a bit of fresh air." She opened the compartment door and stepped out into the narrow corridor. The train rocked gently, the rhythmic hum of the wheels on the rails a constant and reassuring presence beneath her feet. Her steps were soft, almost silent, her attention laser-focused on her surroundings. She paused near the lavatory door, her eyes scanning the area. There, near the edge of the carpet, something small and seemingly insignificant caught her eye. Kneeling down, she carefully adjusted the rug, her fingers searching. Beneath the edge of the carpet, she found it, a single strand of red wool. Her wool, unmistakable in its color and texture. Someone had deliberately pulled a thread from her knitting bag and used it for something, then attempted to conceal the evidence, not expertly, but hurriedly and carelessly. Next to the thread was a tiny silver safety pin, slightly bent and out of shape. She rose slowly, smoothing the carpet back into place as she stood. Her gaze swept the corridor, taking in every detail. She moved farther along, toward the luggage rack and the corridor. One brown bag was partially open, its contents slightly exposed. Inside, she saw beige gloves, a neatly folded scarf, and an envelope torn, smudged, and bearing a faded postmark from Beaksley. The words "returned to sender" were barely legible, almost obscured by the smudges. She didn't disturb anything, leaving everything exactly as she found it. She simply noted the details, filing them away in her mind. Then, quietly and unobtrusively, she returned to the compartment. Inside, the air hadn't changed, the tension still palpable, but everyone's posture seemed a little more rigid, a little more weary, weighed down by the mounting evidence and the unspoken accusations. Miss Marple sat back down in her seat. "Truth," she said thoughtfully, her voice breaking the silence, "is like a train. It moves relentlessly forward, whether we're ready for it or not." The colonel frowned, his expression puzzled. "Are we speaking in riddles again, Miss Marple?" "No," she said gently. "I was simply speaking about Clara Barnes and the events that have led us here." She turned to the young man, her gaze direct. "You followed her, didn't you? You admitted that you had a prior connection." He nodded, his expression subdued. "Yes, but I didn't harm her. I only wanted to speak with her." Next, she looked at the teacher, her eyes filled with understanding. "And you were her sister, the last remaining tie she had to her family and her past." The teacher said nothing, her eyes downcast. Miss Marple turned to the maid, her voice softening. "You recognize the perfume she was wearing as the same scent as your former employer. That seemingly insignificant detail matters. Scent is a powerful trigger for memory, and memory can unlock doors to the past." The maid looked down, her expression troubled. And then Miss Marple continued, her gaze settling on the colonel. "We come to you, Colonel, a man with military background, a man who once worked for the Denham family in Beaksley." He stiffened slightly, his jaw tightening. "You've clearly done your research, Miss Marple." "I've done my observing," she corrected him lightly. "I notice your umbrella, with the brass tag from a shop in Beaksley. I notice your words, too. You describe Clara as charming, yet you claim not to have noticed her passing by." "An old habit," he muttered, attempting to dismiss her observation. "I make a habit of observing people. It's a trained skill." "So do I," Miss Marple said, her voice regaining its steeliness. "For example, I observed the red thread that was taken from my knitting bag, the same thread that was later found hidden beneath the carpet outside the lavatory." She opened her hand, revealing the tiny red thread and the bent silver safety pin. The maid gasped, her eyes widening in recognition. That looks like the one I used to pin the colonel's scarf button." Miss Marple smiled sadly, her gaze unwavering. "Yes, the same thread from the same scarf." The colonel's jaw tightened further, his face growing pale. "She was killed silently," Miss Marple continued, her voice low and steady. "Something soft was used, likely a piece of fabric. I believe a scarf was pulled tightly around her neck, perhaps in a moment of anger or panic." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The thread frayed, the pin bent under the strain, the evidence was hastily hidden, and the compartment was silent. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but firm. "I stepped out of the compartment, not just for air, but to confirm what I already suspected in my mind. Someone tried to plant doubt and suspicion by using my own knitting wool, But they didn't count on my noticing how noticeably smaller my ball of yarn had become. She turned to the Colonel, her eyes locking onto his. You said that Clara didn't deserve forgiveness. You said that she had shamed the family, bringing disgrace upon their name. That sounds incredibly personal, Colonel. The Colonel remained silent, his face a mask of stoic resistance. You found a letter, Miss Marple said, her voice barely a whisper. The one she wrote to her sister, a plea for reconciliation and understanding. You didn't want them to reunite, to reestablish their family bond. You saw her walking toward the compartment, and maybe she recognized you, or maybe she simply smiled at you. And that simple act pushed something too far, triggered a reaction you couldn't control. The Colonel finally broke his silence, his voice a low growl. I didn't mean to. She was going to ruin everything all over again, stir up the past, expose secrets that were best left buried. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression a mixture of understanding and sorrow. So you silence her, then you try to tidy up the mess, concealing the red thread, hiding the scarf. You hid the envelope near the luggage rack, hoping it would remain undiscovered. But you forgot one crucial thing, Colonel. Guilt always leaves loose ends, no matter how carefully you try to conceal them. The train began to slow, its wheels screeching against the tracks. The conductor's voice rang out, announcing the next stop. Next stop, Weston. Miss Marple stood up, her gaze sweeping across the faces in the compartment. The police will be waiting for us at the platform, she said, her voice clear and steady, and I suspect they will find enough evidence to complete the story. She turned to the window as the small town of Weston came into view, bathed in the soft, diffused light of the post-storm sky. Behind her, the others sat in stunned silence, the weight of truth pressing down upon them. The train rolled forward, its journey nearing its end, and justice was waiting patiently at the station. The train moved with a quiet purpose through the dark countryside, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the rails providing a steady, hypnotic hum inside the compartment. However, that rhythm was now disturbed, not by any sudden movement or jarring noise, but by memory, by the lingering echoes of the events that had transpired. Colonel Reed had been escorted away at the last stop, Weston Thames, into the custody of Inspector Melrose and 2 uniformed constables. But what remained behind was not relief, not a sense of closure, but a pervasive sense of doubt, an unsettling feeling that all the pieces of the puzzle hadn't yet fallen into place. Miss Marple sat in her seat, calm and still on the surface, but far from at peace. Her eyes didn't rest on the landscape rushing past the window, but on the others in the compartment, the young man with the troubled eyes, the quiet maid, and the pale teacher who had only recently been revealed to be Clara Barnes's half-sister, a secret carefully concealed until now. The teacher, whose real name we now knew was Helen Cresswell, broke the silence, her voice soft and hesitant. Miss Marple, she said, I'm troubled by something. Miss Marple looked up, inviting the question with a kind nod. I keep thinking about something Clara did just before she came into our carriage, Helen continued, her brow furrowed with concern. You yourself mentioned it. She paused outside another compartment. Not ours. Why did she do that? Ah, Miss Marple replied, her eyes sparkling slightly with interest. That is precisely what I've been pondering as well. Thank you for voicing it. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret across the crackling silence. You see, she said, Clara was not simply wandering aimlessly through the train. She was searching for someone or something. That pause before reaching our carriage was deliberate, intentional. She had another purpose in mind. She meant to confront someone else before she spoke with you. The young man, Michael, straightened up in his seat, his attention now fully engaged. But if Colonel Reed was a killer, then who was the person Clara paused for? The person she intended to speak with first? That is what we must discover, said Miss Marple, her voice firm. I suspect that Clara had more than one reason for boarding this train. Reuniting with her sister was undoubtedly important to her. Yes, but there was also something else, something unresolved from her past that she felt compelled to address. Before anyone could respond, the compartment door slid open and Inspector Melrose stepped back inside. His hat was in his hand, and his coat bore fresh droplets of rain, a testament to the lingering effects of the recent storm. "Pardon the interruption," he said, addressing Miss Marple specifically. "Miss Marple, may I have a word with you?" She rose gracefully and joined him in the corridor. They walked a short distance, then stopped by an empty tea lounge. "He's confessed," Melrose said simply, his voice low and somber. Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. "But not entirely, I suspect." Melrose hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "He's admitted to attacking Clara," he said, claiming that she threatened to expose something about the Denham estate, an affair, possibly even financial misconduct. He claims he lost control in the heat of the moment, grabbed the scarf in a fit of rage, but he insists that she was already upset when she arrived. He overheard her arguing with someone else earlier, before she even reached his compartment. Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly, her mind already racing, piecing together the new information. Someone else? Who? Melrose nodded. He said he couldn't see them, just hear their voices. Clara and a man, engaged in a heated argument. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, her focus intensifying. "Then we must investigate the other carriage, the one Clara paused outside, the one where she had this argument. That's where the answers may lie." Without waiting for further discussion, she turned and led the way down the narrow corridor, her footsteps swift and purposeful. A few carriages back, she paused outside a compartment marked private, reserved. The door, curiously, was unlocked, a detail that immediately caught her attention. She opened it slowly and cautiously. The space inside was immaculately clean, almost sterile, as if it had been meticulously scrubbed and sanitized. A large leather medical bag lay on the seat, partially unzipped. Beside it, a neatly folded tweed overcoat rested, and in the pocket of that coat, something was sticking out slightly, a photograph. Miss Marple gently reached out and pulled it free. It was old, black and white, and curled at the edges with age. Two young people were smiling brightly in the frame, their faces filled with youthful optimism. Clara Barnes and a man, his arm casually draped around her shoulder. Not Colonel Reed, but someone younger, broad-shouldered and undeniably handsome. Melrose leaned in for a closer look. His curiosity piqued. "Who's that?" "I don't know yet," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze fixed on the photograph. "But someone will." Footsteps sounded softly behind them, approaching rapidly. Michael, the young man, appeared at the doorway, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. "I saw you leave," he said, his voice slightly breathless. "I couldn't just sit there doing nothing." Miss Marple handed him the photograph, her eyes searching his face. "Do you recognize this man?" Michael looked closely at the photograph, his eyebrows slowly rising in recognition. "Yes," he said, "that's Dr. Fenwick. He used to work in Beaksley at the local clinic. My father knew him. He left town rather suddenly after some kind of scandal. Something about forged prescriptions or missing medical files. I can't quite recall the details." Melrose and Miss Marple exchanged a significant glance, their minds working in unison. "This bag," Miss Marple said, gently unzipping the medical bag, "contains medical tools, bandages, sedatives, all the essentials of a traveling doctor's kit. But there's no registration to show he's actually a doctor registered with any railway staff." Melrose's voice grew tense, his suspicions mounting. "You think this man boarded the train under a false name, using an assumed identity?" "I do," Miss Marple replied, her tone unwavering. "And I think Clara recognized him, or knew something he was worried about. That's why they argued. Perhaps he was the first person she was searching for on this train, the first person she intended to confront about the past." Back in their original compartment, Helen and the maid looked up with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as the three returned. "There's another thread to this tangled mystery," Miss Marple said gently, taking her seat once more. "One that runs far deeper than Colonel Reed's guilt, and involves a man named Dr. Fenwick." She turned to Helen, her expression sympathetic. "Did Clara ever mention a man named Fenwick to you at any time in your life?" Helen shook her head, her eyes filled with confusion. "No, I don't think so. but I do recall that she once worked at a clinic briefly in Beaksley a long time ago. Then she just disappeared without a trace, leaving everything behind. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind piecing together the fragments of the story. It's entirely possible that she knew something back then, she said. Something about this man, Dr. Fenwick. Perhaps he blackmailed her, or used her name for some kind of fraudulent scheme. Maybe she even had some kind of proof, a damaging letter, a compromising file. But why now? Michael asked, his brow furrowed with confusion. Why approach him after all these years, after all this time has passed? Because secrets, like old wounds, don't always heal cleanly, Miss Marple said simply, her voice filled with understanding. They fester beneath the surface, and eventually they demand to be addressed. Perhaps Clara wanted to finally set things right for herself, and for her sister, to finally find some peace after all these years of turmoil. But, tragically, she never got the chance. Just then, a uniformed constable appeared at the compartment door, his face etched with urgency. "Inspector," he said, addressing Melrose, "we've apprehended a man attempting to jump off the train near the last junction. He claims his name is Martin Rhodes, but he has no identification on him whatsoever, and he's acting very suspiciously. He was found in the private carriage, the one you were just investigating." Miss Marple stood up immediately, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of anticipation and determination. "Let's go," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. The man they brought back was older than the man in the photograph, his hair streaked with gray, his coat damp with rain. His hands were outwardly calm, but his eyes flickered with recognition when he saw the photograph Miss Marple held out to him. "Dr. Fenwick?" she asked, her voice steady and unwavering. He sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping with resignation. "I haven't gone by that name in many years," he admitted. "You knew Clara Barnes, didn't you?" she pressed. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, once, long ago." "What were you doing on this train, Dr. Fenwick?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. He hesitated for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and fear. "She wrote to me," he said finally, his voice cracking with emotion. "Said she wanted to talk, to meet me. I didn't respond at first. I didn't want to reopen the past, didn't want to relive those memories. But eventually I came anyway. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could finally explain myself, offer some kind of apology for the pain I caused her." "Explain what?" Melrose asked, his voice sharp and accusatory. "Explain that I ruined her life," he said, his voice breaking. "That I betrayed her trust and shattered her innocence. She trusted me once, and I took advantage of her kindness, and used her. I used her identity to order drugs and sell them on the black market. When she found out what I had done, she was devastated. She vanished without a trace, left everything behind, and I never saw her again." Miss Marple studied him closely, her eyes searching for any sign of deception. "And you never saw her again until today?" she asked. "No," he said, shaking his head sadly. "Not until today. She didn't even speak to me, just looked at me with such disappointment in her eyes. It was like a knife to the heart." Miss Marple turned to Melrose, her expression thoughtful. "I believe him," she said. "He didn't kill her, but his presence on the train, his past actions, pushed things over the edge. It set in motion a chain of events that ultimately led to her death." Colonel Reed said that he saw them speaking. Melrose said, his brow furrowed. "He must have overheard something, assumed the worst, and acted out of blind panic." "Exactly," Miss Marple concluded, her voice soft but firm. They returned to their original compartment, the atmosphere now heavier than ever with unspoken truths and lingering regrets. Helen sat quietly, her eyes misty with unshed tears. "I didn't know any of this," she whispered, her voice filled with anguish. "I didn't even know that Clara was on that train because of me, to reconnect with me after all these years." Miss Marple reached out and gently touched her hand, offering a silent gesture of comfort. "She came to find you, Helen," she said, her voice filled with empathy. "That much is certain. And I believe that she had already forgiven you, even before she spoke to you. That much I truly believe. And as the train rolled on to the darkness, carrying its passengers towards their destination, the distant lights of London glittered on the horizon, a beacon of hope in the night. Only one chapter remained to be written, only one loose end remained to be tied. The truth was nearly home. The train's whistle pierced the stillness of the early morning air as it approached its final stop, Paddington Station. The dim glow of the carriage lights flickered slightly, casting elongated shadows along the narrow corridor, adding to the sense of quiet anticipation. But within the final compartment of the third carriage, silence had taken on a different quality, a different tone. It was no longer the silence of suspense or fear, but of resolution, of acceptance. Miss Marple, seated once again with her knitting resting peacefully in her lap, looked up calmly as the bustling platform slid into view outside the window, signaling the end of their long journey. Around her sat the other occupants of the compartment. Helen Cresswell, now composed but still visibly weary from the emotional turmoil of the past few hours. Michael, the young man, whose troubled gaze had softened into one of quiet regret, acknowledging the mistakes he had made. And the maid, still pale but no longer trembling with fear, her ordeal finally drawing to a close. Inspector Melrose entered the compartment, his expression thoughtful and somewhat somber. The man claiming to be Martin Rhodes has been fully identified as Dr. Alfred Fenwick, he announced. His confession, partial though it may be, aligns with the evidence we've gathered, and corroborates the events that have transpired. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting the early morning light. Yes, she said, I believe that all the pieces of this intricate puzzle have finally come together, and now form a clear and coherent picture. She gently set her knitting aside, carefully folded her hands in her lap. Shall we, for the sake of clarity and closure, piece the story together right from the very beginning? She asked, her voice carrying a soft but unmistakable command. The others leaned in closer, drawn by the gentle authority in her voice. Clara Barnes, Miss Marple began, her gaze sweeping across each of their faces, was not simply returning to reunite with her sister after years of separation. She was also returning to close chapters from her past, to confront demons that had haunted her for far too long, to seek redemption for wrongs that had been committed. She paused, allowing her words to resonate in the silent compartment. She had been wronged, cast aside, and forgotten by the Denhams, and by those who clung to their name and their reputation like a shield, desperate to protect their carefully constructed facade. Colonel Reed, she explained, was one such man, fiercely loyal to the Denham family and determined to protect their secrets at any cost. Helen's eyes brimmed with tears, but she remained silent, listening intently. Clara had written a letter to her sister, a letter not of accusation or recrimination, but of reconciliation, of forgiveness, and of a desire to rebuild their broken relationship. Yet she was also in possession of something else, something far more dangerous. Knowledge of a former scandal involving Dr. Fenwick, a scandal that threatened to expose long-buried secrets and shatter the carefully maintained image of respectability that the Denham family had so painstakingly cultivated over the years. Involving Dr. Fenwick. He'd used her identity before, forging prescriptions and disappearing when he was discovered. Clara had evidence, probably a medical file or a statement. She wanted justice, not revenge, but the truth to come out. Miss Marple glanced at Inspector Melrose. She was planning to give that information to the authorities. I believe she asked to meet Dr. Fenwick on the train, hoping to confront him calmly, maybe even get him to confess. But she never got the chance. Michael's voice wavered a bit, because Colonel Reed had seen them. Yes, Miss Marple confirmed. He overheard Clara talking, recognized her, and saw her speaking to a man he didn't know. And because of his rigid loyalty to the Denham name, he jumped to the worst conclusion, that Clara was about to destroy what was left of the family's reputation. She paused for a moment. He acted without thinking. When Clara stopped outside our carriage, she might have smiled, maybe even said his name, and in that instant, everything he'd been suppressing for decades came flooding back. He used his scarf, a military-issue one, and strangled her. It wasn't planned, just panic and pride taking over. And the thread? Helen asked softly. He used one of my knitting threads to secure the button that came loose from the scarf. A hurry job. He didn't realize how obvious it would be when that thread was later found beneath the lavatory carpet, along with the bent safety pin, and the torn envelope postmarked from Beaksley. The maid whispered, "I remember the scent." She wore the same perfume as Lady Denham. "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Even a scent can bring back memories. But guilt leaves behind more than just a smell. It creates cracks in stories and alibis in the way someone carries themselves." Colonel Reed was stiff with fear, not righteous anger. Inspector Melrose nodded slowly. "And Dr. Fenwick. He didn't kill Clara," Miss Marple stated, "but his presence played a role. Clara was trying to connect all the dots. Her sister, the doctor, her own past. By doing so, she became too much of a risk to those who were hiding secrets." Michael looked down at his shoes. "I followed her," he mumbled. "I thought she might ruin my chances at school. I didn't want her near Helen, but I never touched her. I swear." "I know," Miss Marple said kindly. "You were angry, but anger alone doesn't kill." The brakes screeched as the train started to slow down. Paddington Station appeared ahead, iron girders curving like the ribs of a huge, exhausted animal. Commuters and porters were bustling around beyond the glass. Miss Marple stood up, smoothing out her coat. "We've lost a woman," she said softly, who was hoping to reclaim her name and her place in the world. She wanted to be heard, not to cause drama or embarrassment, but to find closure. That she died in silence is a tragedy, but that her truth will now be known, that at least is a form of justice. Helen stood next to her. "I'll make sure her letter gets delivered to the right people, and I'll write one of my own." Miss Marple smiled. "That would be very appropriate." As the train came to a complete stop, the doors opened all along the platform. Passengers hurried off, unaware of the human drama that had taken place in the quietest corner of the third carriage. Colonel Reed, now under guard, was escorted off the train. Dr. Fenwick, no longer hiding behind a false name, was taken into separate custody for questioning. Miss Marple stepped on the platform, the air crisp and clear after the long, rain-soaked journey. Inspector Melrose joined her. "Another mystery solved by you," he said. She chuckled softly. "Oh, no, Inspector, I just clarified things. People reveal everything if you know how to listen to what they're not saying." He tipped his hat. "I'll see you home." Miss Marple smiled and walked forward, her step light but determined. The train had carried more than just passengers that night. It had carried memories, regrets, secrets, and finally, the truth. Now, as the sun started to break through clouds above Paddington, a quiet kind of justice had arrived, not with a lot of noise or violence, but with the steady hands of an old lady who noticed everything.